The first thing Levi Zook heard, at 11 minutes past midnight, was a boot scraping against gravel outside a window that should not have had anyone standing near it. He was awake before his eyes even opened all the way. That's the part he could never fully explain to anyone in Walnut Ridge who asked him about that night afterward, and plenty of them did, for months. How does a 41-year-old dairy farmer go from dead asleep to fully alert, silent, and moving in under 4 seconds? Levi never gave them a real answer. He'd just say something about being a light sleeper and change the subject, and most people let it go, because that's what you do in a small Amish community. You let a man keep the parts of himself he doesn't offer up. But his wife Hannah knew. Hannah had known for 11 years, since before they married, and in 11 minutes, she was about to watch the man she loved become someone she had only heard about in the stories he almost never told. I'm going to tell you the whole thing tonight, start to finish, because I think you deserve to know exactly who Levi Zook was before you find out what he was about to do. So let's not rush toward the barn with the boot outside the window just yet. Let's go back 6 years, to a farm called Cedar Hollow, and to a man who thought he'd finally left all of that behind him for good. If you're the kind of person who's ever had to carry something heavy and quiet, a past nobody else knows about, a version of yourself you had to leave behind to become who you are now, I think this one's going to hit you somewhere specific. Stick around for it, and hey, if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there's a lot more where this came from, and I'd genuinely love to have you back for the next one. All right, Cedar Hollow, 6 years earlier. Levi Zook was not born into an ordinary Amish life, though for most of his childhood, it looked exactly like every other boy's childhood in the Walnut Ridge settlement. Barn chores before school, an 8th grade education, Sunday services rotating farm to farm, a father who taught him to read weather in cloud shapes better than any forecast ever could. What made Levi's story different started at 19, during his rumspringa, when, unlike most young men in that stretch of Ohio who spent their running around years buying a used pickup and going to a few too many parties, Levi did something almost nobody in Walnut Ridge's history had ever done. He drove himself to a recruiting office in Canton and enlisted in the United States Army. Nobody in his family understood it. Not fully, not even Levi himself if you'd asked him at the time. He'd talk about it later, on the rare nights he talked about it at all, as something closer to a compulsion than a decision, a restlessness in him that the quiet predictability of Amish life had never quite been able to settle, a need to test himself against something bigger and harder than hay bales and harvest seasons. He became a combat medic. 2 deployments, 4 years, more blood on his hands, other men's blood, men he was trying desperately to save, than any 23-year-old should ever have to carry. He was good at his job, frighteningly good, in the way that only becomes clear to a person once the adrenaline fades and they're left alone with what they did and why they were able to do it so well. The specific night that changed everything for Levi isn't a story he's ever told publicly, and out of respect for that, I'm not going to reconstruct it in more detail than this. He lost a man under his hands he could not save, a friend, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio just like him, and something in Levi broke that night in a way 4 more months of deployment did not give him any time to properly grieve. He came home at 24 an honorably discharged veteran, with a chest full of things he didn't have words for yet, and he did the thing so many veterans do. He tried to disappear into a version of normal life that had absolutely nothing to do with what he'd just survived. He got an apartment in Columbus. He got a job doing HVAC repair. He drank more than he should have for about a year and a half, and he told himself that was just what getting your feet back under you looked like. What actually pulled him out of it wasn't therapy, though he'd eventually do plenty of that too. It was a Sunday, 18 months after his discharge, when, restless and hollowed out and unable to explain even to himself why, he drove back to Walnut Ridge for his grandmother's funeral and sat in the back of a farmhouse during a service conducted entirely in Pennsylvania Dutch and English hymns he hadn't heard in 5 years, and felt something in his chest go quiet for the first time since that night overseas. It wasn't nostalgia, and it wasn't guilt, though both were probably tangled up in it somewhere. It was something closer to recognition, the sense that the specific, unglamorous, deeply communal piece of this life, the kind that asks you to set down your individual will for something larger than yourself, might actually be the only thing on earth capable of meeting the size of what he was carrying. He moved back to Walnut Ridge within the year. He rejoined the church, went through instruction, was baptized at 26, in a decision he later described, to the one person he was ever fully honest with about it, as the first choice he'd made in years that felt like it was actually his, and not just a reaction to something that had happened to him. That one person was Hannah Miller, no relation to the widow from a story I told you a few weeks back, just a common name in Amish country. A quiet, steady, sharp-eyed young woman from a neighboring farm who Levi married 2 years after his baptism, and who was, from the very beginning, the only soul in Walnut Ridge Levi ever told the full truth to. Not the community, not even the bishop, beyond a general acknowledgement that Levi had served and had his reasons for coming home changed. Just Hannah. "I need you to know all of it before you marry me," Levi told her one evening on her family's porch, and then he told her, not every gruesome detail, but enough. Enough that she understood exactly what kind of stillness lived underneath her husband's calm, and exactly what kind of danger he was capable of, if it ever needed to come out again. Hannah married him anyway. Not despite what he told her, but in some ways because of the honesty of it. Because a man willing to hand you the worst thing about himself before asking you to spend your life with him is usually a man worth trusting with the rest of it too. They built Cedar Hollow together over the following 6 years into a small, thriving dairy operation. 31 acres they owned outright, plus another 40 they leased from an elderly widower 2 farms over who could no longer work his own back fields. They had 2 children, Noah, 10, sharp and curious, and constantly chasing something across the property, usually a runaway goat, and Rachel, 7, who'd inherited her mother's watchful stillness and could apparently tell what mood the cows were in before anyone else in the family noticed. Levi Zook, by every appearance in Walnut Ridge, was simply a good, quiet, hard-working Amish farmer. Nobody but Hannah knew what he'd once been trained to do to another human being with his bare hands in under 6 seconds. Levi had spent 6 years hoping, with his whole heart, that he would never have to find out whether he still remembered how. Now, let's talk about the barn. The 40 leased acres at the back of Cedar Hollow's property bordered a stretch of mostly unused woodland that belonged to the county, dense enough that almost nobody had reason to walk it beyond an occasional deer hunter in November. Tucked into the tree line, half collapsed and forgotten, sat an old tobacco curing barn that had belonged to a farm that hadn't existed in any working form for 30 years. Technically part of the leased land, but so far from Cedar Hollow's working fields that Levi hadn't set foot inside it more than twice in 6 years. Which made it, as it turned out, an almost perfect place for a man named Marcus Vance to store product. Marcus Vance ran a methamphetamine distribution operation that moved through 3 counties, careful, well-organized, and, this was the part that would come out only much later, quietly protected by a corrupt sheriff's deputy named Roy Delaney, who fed Vance's crew information about patrol schedules and DEA task force movement in exchange for a cut that had, over 2 years, bought him a boat he told his wife he'd financed through overtime. Delaney was the one who'd identified the old tobacco barn as a stash location 8 months earlier. Remote, forgotten, technically on leased Amish land that Delaney correctly guessed nobody paid much attention to, since everyone in the county knew Amish farmers rarely called the police about anything, ever, on principle. It was, from a criminal's perspective, close to the perfect hiding spot. Nobody watching it. Nobody likely to report it even if they somehow stumbled onto it, given the community's deep discomfort with legal entanglement. What Delaney and Vance didn't account for was a 10-year-old boy chasing a goat. On a Tuesday afternoon in late September, Noah Zook's favorite goat, a stubborn brown and white nanny named Buttons, slipped her tether and bolted straight for the tree line at the back of the property. Noah, as any 10-year-old would, chased her the better part of a mile before finally cornering her near the old tobacco barn. And it was there, catching his breath with Buttons's rope finally back in his hand, that he noticed the barn's old side door wasn't hanging the way it always had. It was closed properly, recently, with a shiny new padlock that looked completely out of place on a building that had otherwise been slowly rotting into the ground for 3 decades. Noah, being 10 and curious, and having absolutely no framework for understanding what a padlocked barn full of packaged narcotics might mean, mentioned it to his father that evening at supper, entirely in passing, the way children mention 100 small, strange things a day. "Somebody put a new lock on the old tobacco barn," Noah said, reaching for another biscuit. "Weird, right?" Levi almost let it pass entirely. It was Hannah, watching her husband's face go very slightly, very briefly still, an old instinct she recognized even after 6 peaceful years, who caught it. "You're going to go look at that, aren't you?" she said quietly, once the children were in bed. "Probably just hunters storing gear," Levi said, but he went and looked the next morning anyway, because whatever peace Levi Zook had built for himself over 6 years had never fully erased the part of him that noticed when something didn't add up. He found the barn locked exactly as Noah described. He didn't break in. Some old training instinct told him not to disturb anything he didn't fully understand yet, but he did notice fresh tire tracks in the dirt leading to the barn from an old logging trail on the county side of the property line, tracks that had no business being there, made by a vehicle far too heavy and far too recently for hunters on foot. Levi mentioned it to no one but Hannah. He decided that same evening that he'd drive into town in the next day or two and quietly ask around, not the sheriff's department directly, since something about the whole situation was pricking at an old, careful instinct he couldn't yet name, but maybe the county extension office, or a neighboring farmer who might know if the old barn's ownership had changed hands. He never got the chance, because 31 hours after Noah mentioned the padlock at the supper table, Marcus Vance's operation got word, through Deputy Delaney, in a panicked phone call, that a DEA-assisted task force sweep was being planned for the following week across 3 counties, targeting exactly the kind of remote rural stash locations Vance's crew relied on. Vance needed his product moved, fast, quietly, that same night, and when his men went to retrieve it from the tobacco barn, they found something that sent Vance into a genuine, dangerous panic. Fresh boot prints near the barn door that weren't their own, and a padlock that showed faint scuff marks suggesting someone had examined it closely without opening it. Vance's read on the situation, delivered to his crew in a tense phone call at 10 that night, was simple and brutally direct. Somebody on that farm had found the barn. Somebody on that farm might already know what was inside it. And with a task force sweep coming in days, Vance was not willing to leave behind any loose thread that could talk. "Go to the farmhouse," Vance told the 3 men he sent. Find out what they know. Handle it quiet. Nobody talks to anybody about what's in that barn." Which is how, at 11 minutes past midnight, 3 armed men in dark clothing moved through the tree line at the back of Cedar Hollow's property, crossed 40 acres of open field under a mostly clouded sky, and approached the Zook farmhouse with the specific, cold intention of finding out exactly what a sleeping Amish family knew, and making absolutely sure they wouldn't be able to tell anyone about it afterward. Levi Zook woke up 4 seconds after the first boot scraped against the gravel path beneath the bedroom window. I want you to sit in this moment with me for just a second before we go further, because everything about the next 20 minutes of Levi's life was about to be decided by 6 years of a peace he'd built on purpose, colliding head-on with 4 years of training he'd spent that same 6 years hoping he'd never need again. If you're finding yourself leaning forward right now, wondering what a man like Levi actually does next, good, stay with me. And go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, because I promise you, the next 15 minutes of this story are going to move fast, and you will not want to miss a second of it. Levi's hand found Hannah's shoulder in the dark, one firm press, a silent signal they had never once needed to actually use before, but had talked through years earlier, back when Levi was first honest with her about what kind of watchfulness might occasionally live inside him even in peacetime. Hannah's eyes opened instantly, and she did not make a sound. "Someone's outside," Levi breathed, barely audible. "Get the children. Cellar. Now. Quiet as you can." He was already moving before he finished the sentence, bare feet silent against the wood floor, some deeply buried part of his training taking over the exact muscles that 6 years of milking cows and mending fences had kept strong, without Levi ever quite realizing why he'd kept them that strong. He heard the second man now, circling toward the back door. 3 of them, his instincts told him almost instantly, based on spacing and rhythm. One at the window he'd first heard, one moving toward the back, one likely holding position near the front to watch the drive. Professional enough to coordinate, not professional enough to move without sound on gravel. Levi had, by his own later account to the one sheriff's deputy he ended up trusting with the full story, exactly 2 advantages in that moment. He knew every square inch of his own farmhouse in total darkness. And these men, whoever they were, had absolutely no idea what kind of man they'd just decided to corner in his own home. The back door's old lock gave way with a soft, splintering crack 30 seconds later, and the first man stepped into Levi's kitchen expecting, based on everything Marcus Vance's crew understood about Amish farmers, to find an unarmed, non-violent, probably terrified man they could intimidate into silence within minutes. What he found instead was Levi Zook's forearm locking around his throat from the darkness beside the doorway before he'd taken his second full step inside, a controlled, practiced pressure that had the man unconscious on the kitchen floor in under 8 seconds without a single sound loud enough to travel past the walls. Levi will tell you, if you ever get him to talk about that night at length, that this was the single hardest moment of the entire ordeal. Not the danger, not the fear for his family, but the split-second decision, made almost entirely on old training and new conviction working in tandem, to restrain rather than to end. Every instinct his military training had ever drilled into him screamed for a different, more permanent kind of certainty. Every year of the peace he'd built with Hannah, every Sunday service, every quiet conviction he'd carried since his baptism about the sanctity of even a stranger's life, held that instinct back. He zip-tied the first man's wrists and ankles with a coil of baling twine from the mudroom, gagged him with a dish towel, and moved. The second man, coming through the back hallway, took a lamp base to the side of the skull, hard enough to drop him, but not hard enough to kill, a calculation Levi made in less than a second of pure muscle memory and moral conviction fighting side by side. He was restrained the same way, dragged into the pantry, door wedged shut. The third man, the one who'd been watching the front drive, heard something wrong through the walls after 90 seconds of silence from his partners, and made the decision that would end up costing his entire operation everything. He came through the front door with a handgun already raised, shouting for his partners, and found Levi Zook standing calmly in the middle of his own living room, hands slightly raised, in a posture that read, for one critical half-second, like surrender. It wasn't. It was distance management, a controlled invitation to close the exact 3 feet of space Levi needed. When the man closed that distance, gun still raised, Levi's hand closed around the weapon and redirected it toward the ceiling in the same motion that swept the man's legs out from under him, dropping him hard onto the farmhouse floorboards with enough controlled force to knock the air from his lungs and the weapon from his hand. But, and this mattered enormously to Levi, in the accounting he did with his own conscience for months afterward, without a single shot fired, and without a blow struck harder than exactly what was needed to end the threat. By the time Hannah, crouched in the cellar with both children pressed silent against her sides, heard her husband's voice calling the all clear up the stairs, less than 4 minutes had passed since the first boot scraped against the gravel. Levi called 911 himself, gave a calm, precise account of 3 restrained intruders in his home, and then did something that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in the story. He called Hannah's cousin, a member of the Walnut Ridge Church, who happened to also serve as a volunteer on the county's Rural Crime Watch, and asked him to personally make sure the responding officers were not, under any circumstances, Deputy Roy Delaney. That instinct, the same careful, watchful part of Levi that had never fully turned off, even after 6 years of trying, turned out to be the single most important decision of the entire night. Because when Sheriff's Deputy Angela Ruiz arrived 22 minutes later, a woman with 11 years on the force and a clean reputation nobody had ever managed to find a stain on, she was the one who found 3 unconscious, professionally restrained men on Levi Zook's farmhouse floor. Listen to Levi's full account with the barn and the padlock and the tire tracks, and Marcus Vance's name coming up from one of the restrained men's own panicked, semi-conscious muttering, and was the one who put together, within about 6 hours, that this wasn't a random home invasion at all, but the messy, panicked collapse of an operation that had been protected by someone inside her own department. The task force sweep that had panicked Vance's crew into acting that night happened 4 days early instead of the following week, expanded significantly once federal investigators heard what Deputy Ruiz had uncovered. Marcus Vance was arrested at a motel outside Canton, attempting to liquidate his remaining product before fleeing the state. Deputy Roy Delaney was arrested 9 days later on federal corruption charges after financial records tied his boat payments directly to Vance's operation with an ugly, undeniable clarity. Levi Zook was never charged with anything. Ohio's self-defense statutes, combined with Deputy Ruiz's own clear-eyed report and the restrained, non-lethal nature of every single action he'd taken that night, made the legal side of it, in the end, almost anticlimactic. The much harder part, for Levi, was everything that came after in his own community. Word travels fast and strangely in a small settlement, and within a week, most of Walnut Ridge knew some version of what had happened at Cedar Hollow, a version that grew, as these things do, into something closer to legend than fact by the 3rd or 4th retelling. Levi Zook, mild, quiet, hard-working Levi Zook, had apparently taken down 3 armed men with his bare hands in the middle of the night to protect his family. He worried, more than almost anything else in the whole ordeal, about how the church would receive it. Amish communities hold non-resistance, a refusal to meet violence with violence, as one of the deepest, most sacred convictions of the faith, a value Levi himself had come to believe in with his whole heart over 6 hard years of building this life. He had not killed anyone that night. He had been fiercely, deliberately careful about that, in a way almost nobody outside his own head would ever fully understand the cost of. But he had used force, real, trained, dangerous force. And he did not know. Walking into the bishop's farmhouse 8 days later for a conversation he'd been dreading, whether that would be understood, or whether it would cost him the community he'd worked so hard to belong to again. Bishop Amos Troyer, an older man, gentle-voiced, who'd known Levi since before his Rumspringa, listened to Levi's full, unflinching account without interrupting once. He asked about the men's condition afterward. He asked, very specifically and very carefully, whether Levi had believed in that moment there was any way to protect his family that didn't involve the force he'd used. "No," Levi said honestly. "Not in the time I had. I've turned it over 100 times since. I don't see another way that keeps them alive." The bishop sat with that answer for a long moment. "Our peace is not a peace of weakness," he finally said. "It is a peace we choose, every day, when we have the power to choose otherwise." You had that power in your hands, Levi, more fully than nearly any man in this church ever will, and by every account I've heard, you chose the narrowest possible path through violence that still ended with every soul in that house alive, including 3 men who came meaning you harm. I cannot find fault in that. I think, if anything, most men would not have had the discipline to walk as narrow a path as you walked that night. It wasn't absolution exactly, because Levi never asked for absolution. He'd made his peace with the choice itself, in the cellar of his own conscience, long before he ever sat down with the bishop. But it was something Levi needed almost as much, to be seen, fully, by the community he loved and not found wanting. Cedar Hollow settled back into its rhythms in the months that followed, though not quite the same rhythms as before. Noah, now something close to a minor local legend among the settlement's children for the goat chase that started it all, took to telling an increasingly elaborate version of the story to anyone who'd listen, much to his parents' amused exasperation. Rachel, quieter about it, took to sitting a little closer to her father during evening chores. Not from fear, Levi came to understand, but from something more like a child's simple, wordless need to be near the parent who'd kept her safe. Hannah, for her part, never once told Levi she wished that night hadn't happened, because she understood something about her husband that took the rest of Walnut Ridge considerably longer to understand. The peace Levi had built over 6 years wasn't fragile. It wasn't a performance that one violent night had shattered. It was, if anything, the exact same conviction, tested at the highest possible cost, and it had held. Every choice Levi made in those 4 minutes, the restraint, the specific and deliberate limits he placed on his own trained capacity for harm, the care he took to ensure 3 men who'd come to hurt his family walked away breathing, was the very same peace he'd chosen every single day since his baptism. It had simply, for one night, been asked to prove itself under conditions no Sunday service could have prepared him for. The old tobacco barn was torn down that spring, at Levi's own insistence, and the wood was repurposed, with a kind of quiet, deliberate symbolism nobody in the family ever felt the need to explain out loud, into a new goat pen for a certain stubborn brown and white nanny named Buttons, whose wandering, as it turned out, had likely saved her entire family's life. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. The quietest people you know are very often carrying things you have absolutely no idea about. Old griefs, old skills, old versions of themselves they've set down on purpose because they chose, deliberately and daily, to become someone gentler. That doesn't mean the old strength is gone. It usually just means they're trusting you enough not to need it around you. And if the day ever comes when it's needed after all, I think Levi Zook's story tells us something worth remembering. That real strength was never about how much damage a person is capable of. It's about how disciplined they can stay, in the exact moment it would be so much easier not to be. If this story kept you here till the very end, that tells me something. So do me a favor before you go. Hit that like button, because it genuinely helps stories like this find the people who need them. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because there's a new one waiting for you every week. And I'd love to know in the comments, what would you have done in Levi's place in those 4 minutes? I read every single one of them. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Take care of yourselves, and take care of the people counting on you to keep them safe.